So thanks for joining us this afternoon, everyone. My name is Alyssa Collins, and I run the hemp program at Penn State for extension efforts. And we've been doing hemp trialing since 2017 at Penn State. But I was just scrolling through the participants that we have on this session, and there are a lot of people on here who have also been doing hemp trialing or hemp research in one way or another. So the nice thing about this session is that it's not set up as a webinar, it's set up as a meeting. So we can share the ability to speak with anyone. So we can all help answer questions as we go, because that's what this is about. It's about sharing latest research findings, because a lot of research is not yet published, but people have been doing it for the past couple of years. So that's what Heather and I tried to do today. We tried to get a sense of what's going on in the country and share little vignettes with you. So we'll do some of that and start some conversation, and hopefully everyone can chime in. Right now, you're going to be seeing a poll on the screen, and we're just asking you to tell us who you are so that we can find out who's benefiting from these and how we should gear our talks. So that would be helpful for the Hemp Summit planners for next year. So go ahead and do that. A few housekeeping things. While presenters are presenting, if you could just stay muted, that would be fantastic. And we will, if you would like to talk or ask a question, go ahead and put that in the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to talk during the first part of our session. Heather's going to take the second part, so we will help moderate for each other. So we'll be looking, and hopefully Heather can flag me down and stop me when I need to be stopped. Let's see, is there anything else I needed to tell you folks? I think that about covers what we need to address at the beginning here. Joining us today is Heather Darby, who's my colleague from University of Vermont, and she's been doing hemp trialing longer than we have here. So she is a great wealth of information and works in a similar sort of small farm situation as we do in PA. We're so diverse here in PA that what she does in Vermont is more similar than what, let's say, folks out in Colorado and Oregon are doing. So it's great to have her perspective as well. And I'll let her introduce herself a little bit later when we get to present with her. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And we will optimize. Get that going. So hopefully you guys are seeing my title slide here. And before I get really into things, I'm just going to put in a plug for some of the places you might go to find some of the research as it's updated and some of the resources that we have. So we run a Penn State Hemp Twitter account, and we share a lot of information out of there. I also have a couple of other Twitter accounts. One's hemp-based and one's my pathology account, and you can find me here. The best way to reach me is my email, and that's just collins@psu.edu. But I actually farm in Lancaster County. I'm not based at State College, where a lot of my colleagues are. I'm here in the heart of the breadbasket of Pennsylvania, so I get to do some of the same farming that probably a lot of you are doing. But, you know, I mentioned that we don't have a whole lot of published data yet, right? And you're all well aware of that. And we heard that several times this morning. So how are we finding some of this information? And where are we getting started? And I think many of you have probably gotten a sense that we're really starting with a lot of anecdotal knowledge, either from, you know, what these folks said about their experience, historical knowledge that we can find in some historical references, underground knowledge because of the medical marijuana industry and the recreational marijuana industry, And we pull from our international friends who have never been forced to stop growing hemp. So we don't have as much information coming from China. They play a little close to the vest, but our friends in Canada and Europe have been really willing to share with us what they know about how to grow it. It's just that not all of those conditions apply to us here in the Northeast, and things need to be tweaked and changed for us.
Hey, Alyssa, I'm sorry
yeah.
to bother you, but
Sure.
there seems to be an issue with your slides. They kind of keep going blurry to clear.
I think if you unshare and then reshare, not optimized for video, it should fix it for you, Alyssa.
Will do. Thank you for letting me know.
And then some people are saying they don't see any slide, which I don't think is necessarily your fault. David, I don't know if you have any suggestions. If there's a place people can go to, I don't really know.
Are you seeing the right thing now?
It looks great now.
Yeah,
the
screen
better.
looks good.
Yep. Sorry about that.
No, I really appreciate you saying something.
Can you actually start back at the beginning? Because what we probably couldn't read the very first chart with all of your contact information.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
And
Thanks.
I can also put that in the chat when we get there, and when we're wrapping up here too, just so it's easier to click. Yeah, so, you know, we're all in this place where we're trying to figure out all the best management practices and everything at the same time. And so a lot of our knowledge is really coming from each other. And 3 excellent growers shared this morning. And honestly, that's where we as academics are learning a lot too. And, you know, we're very lucky here in Pennsylvania that we have growers like that who are willing to share with us and invite us over and say, hey, here's my operation, here's my challenges, and here's what worked for me. And we're learning so much from them. I'm sure more than they're learning from us, but we get to synthesize it and then put it out there for everyone too. So we benefit all together. So the other folks who we're learning from are our fellow researchers, and they've been doing stuff in their neck of the woods. So I'm going to be showing you data and information that's not quite published yet because they don't have quite enough data to make a publication maybe, or maybe it's just not out and published yet because these things take time. But I'm pulling from, you know, folks in Kentucky and Montana and North Carolina and things like that. And they've been really willing to share. But you can see we've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. It's just, it's not quite out there yet. So I'm going to share a little bit about what we do know and where we need to still do more work. Now, speaking of research, we're all looking for funding to do this research because federal funding sources don't always allow hemp research. And so there have not been as many places to get grant monies for hemp as for some other crops. So there is a push right now to start a hemp checkoff program. Those of you who are familiar with growing grains, corn, soybeans, wheat, may be familiar with checkoff programs. That's where every bushel you sell, they take like a fraction of a penny and put it towards marketing and put it towards research. And right now, the hemp industry is considering doing this. So if you have an opinion about that, go and let them know. And maybe if you're interested, just visit this website to find out more about what a potential checkoff program would look like. If you remember the Got Milk campaign, that was funded through a checkoff program for milk, dairy. So right now, I'm going to be talking about the fiber and grain market classes, and then Heather's going to take over. We'll transition to some of the essential oil or CBD type. And I'm going to start off by talking a little bit, I'll kind of bookend it with some of what we've been doing in Pennsylvania. And then we'll take you to other places in the country. So we started, like I said, in 2017 with some very small trials just to do some agronomics. But in 2019 and 2020, we joined together with other researchers across the country to do a multi-state variety trial for dual purpose varieties. So varieties that you would be able to get fiber and grain from purportedly. And this was funded, the College of Ag actually put up money for this. And this year we were able to get some funding through the state, so through the Specialty Crop Block Grant, which we were really grateful for. So we had some issues with emergence in 2019, and 2020 doesn't get better on any front, and that includes hemp emergence. But here, what we're seeing is the crusting that took place, because after we planted, we got about 3 days of rain, and then it dried up. We didn't get any rain. It was pretty hot, and it crusted over. So we didn't get really great yield data, but we were able to get enough to kind of compare one variety against another and see how they did with emergence success and stature and grain production, just kind of relative to one another, but really not what their real yield potential should be. And you can see, when you don't get great emergence, you get a lot of weeds that come in there, and that's exactly what happened. So it's not a great representation of these varieties, but here are the varieties that we included in this year, and we repeated a bunch of these in 2020, and I'm sure Heather had a bunch of these as well. So what we're looking at here is these varieties. I have actually ordered them in height order, so kind of like in school. The shortest kids in the front. And so Katani is our shortest and Futura 75 is our tallest. And that really does represent what these varieties were bred to do. So the ones on this end here, everything I'm circling now, those really are pretty pure grain varieties. You can get fiber off them, but they were not bred for fiber. So they're really bred for grain production. And that's reflected in their yields over here. Whereas down here, these French varieties, they're really bred for fiber production. And they have really respectable yields of grain, but their height is just that much more, it's usually double what we're looking at with the grain varieties. And then somewhere in the middle, you will see varieties that really probably could do both. So here, those are our grain varieties. These are our nice tall varieties. And those are the ones that I would say are well positioned in Pennsylvania to go either way, if you really are trying to do a dual purpose crop. But if you're trying to do one or the other, choose your varieties on that basis. And we can see, it really does give us a respectable yield with grain. However, the stem diameter is quite a bit wider than some of these other varieties, which might make it a little harder to harvest. It might make it just something that you'd want to consider depending on your end use. So something like this is going to give you more hurd component versus the bast fiber. And depending on who you're selling that fiber to, they might care about that. So take that into consideration as well. So in 2020, we tried most of these varieties again. And, our preparation of the field, because we've got this type of outfit here. So this is our plot planter. And a cone planter like this is not well suited for no-till production. Plus, that combined with the fact that we need to control weeds meant that we really did need to till this. And so we've been working on bed preparation for the past couple of years, because we think that's really key here to getting a good stand and good emergence. However, again, this year, we planted, we got a mess of rain, hot, dry weather caused crusting. And you can see that happening here, and our little baby hemps trying to make their way out of the ground. And it was just really challenging. We got some, but not enough. So we did try an approach with a rotary hoe. And so this is some old school equipment that no one ever throws anything out in Lancaster County. So we decided to pull this out. We'd never used it before since I've been the director at this research center, and said, you know, what can it hurt? So we actually ran this across half of each plot. We ran it crosswise, and we wanted to see if we could break up that soil crust. So you can see it's aggressive, but we figured what do we have to lose at this point? And you can see it really does break up that crust. This was the half of the plot that we left alone, and this is the half that we broke up. I think if we had done this sooner, it probably would have worked better, but as it was probably to the point where a lot of those seedlings had emerged, tried to push their way out, and then just given up. So unfortunately, we did not get a great stand, really weedy in there. We replanted this again and tried again, and it just was too late in the season. And I think part of this is the fact that we're waiting for some of those seeds to get to us from our cooperators in Kentucky. So by the time it gets to us, if we have missed that early May planting window, sometimes we don't get another weather window that's good for planting until much later. And I think that's hurting us here. So next year, I think we're going to try a few different things with getting things planted and emerged in field preparation. But this did give us an opportunity to find out, well, you know, we dug up some of these seedlings and saw evidence of maybe some damping off. So we want to know if disease might be a player here as well, especially in some of our heavier soils. So we dug a bunch of these up. My poor intern, she didn't have hemp to count, but she had hemp to dig at this point. And we have been finding some pathogens that are associated with damping off in other systems. So this is more than likely a fusarium. This is most likely a pythium. And we're going to be culturing and sequencing these over the winter. So hopefully we'll know more about that next year. We did do another site of this trial up at Center County at our Rock Springs farm. And our guys up there were able to get irrigation on it. So we got nice emergence there and didn't get crusting, and that was a blessing. But that went in much later. So we did take data, and we'll have comparison data for that, but I still think we can do better in the future. Our friends at Cornell also had some of these same issues, and this is kind of a recognized issue across all our trial sites, is that you don't get perfect planting conditions, you can get damping off, you can get some of this crusting. And so the pythium that we saw, the fusarium that we saw, rhizoctonia is another one. How can we maybe better protect our seeds against this? In Europe, there are seed treatments that are approved for hemp use. And can we look at some of those here in the United States and see if they're worthwhile? And if so, maybe we can pursue getting them labeled. So they did this in 2019. And these are the products that they used. In 2019, they had really good field prep and good emergence conditions. So I'll show you the 2 years compared. But what you're looking at is the controls that had no treatments are here in black. So there was a red dye on this one just to give it color. But the ones that are in green are what we would call our biological treatments. So these are mostly OMRI listed. There's some of these softer chemistries. Red is our phosphite type products. So these, some of them are OMRI listed. They are, they're like phosphorus, phosphoric acid based. And then our blue ones are our more traditional chemistries that are true fungicides. And so what we saw in this year was about 3 weeks after planting, they did stand counts. And they saw that all of the traditional chemistries, along with the phosphite type materials, did give significantly better stands than all the other OMRI listed materials and the controls. However, next year, they had a later planting conditions, just like we had these last couple of years in Pennsylvania, where they had wetness followed by hot, dry conditions, and they got crusting. And in this year, it was much more challenging. The only two that gave a better stand were Apron plus Maxim plus Murtect, and Apron, Maxim, Natural, which is actually one of these biologicals. So it was a much tougher year in this 2020 year. So this is the direction that some folks are looking at for seed treatments, and we'll keep you updated there. Our colleagues in Kentucky, again, same sort of issues. And I think this is probably an issue that's very common to some of these small research variety trials, because we have such small plots. We don't have the benefit of being able to go into a field and pick like the best part of the field where we take our information from. These are like 5 by 20 feet long. So if we don't get it right the first time, we don't usually have enough seed to replete plant or to plant really large areas. You know, there's a benefit to planting hemp seed shallow, and that is, you know, faster emergence, better weed competition because it's coming up and getting a canopy quicker, but it's also more subject to rapid drying if you don't get rain. And birds can just, birds have followed our planter and just picked out seeds when we planted too shallow. So that's a real issue because hemp is a lot like soybean, you know, crusting can be a challenge. So at Kentucky, Bob Pierce and his friends were looking at a lot of these same varieties. And you could see, even though we're getting great germination on most of these varieties, you know, some are around 70 and in the 80s, the field emergence was not near that. You were lucky if you got, you know, 50% field emergence. And that's kind of a challenge across this type of hemp. So looking at the varieties and the emergence in like bar graph form, really, some of them did not compete really well in our conditions. So again, these, some of the names I'm not very great at pronouncing. Lukhovskii, maybe. I think that's one of our Ukrainian varieties. Futura and USO 31 didn't do real well in terms of emergence, but some of the others did relatively better. In terms of yield, Bob actually combined a lot of the data from our multi-state project, and some of the sites reported straw yield where they could. And you see some of the ones that we would expect to perform really well on yield are the ones that did. And so Fedora, Felina, some of those ones that are really labeled as fiber varieties did really well on straw yield, but the Ukrainian ones did really well too. All these here and USO1. So those are all in contention still. And they also found that, you know, our Fedora and Felina, these fiber varieties, they performed really darn well in yield of grain as well. So all of these are still contenders, but you can also see how spotty the data is from site to site. So I think we don't get a true sense of how these varieties are performing everywhere for another year or two. Another thing that they noticed, and this is one of the fun things that happens when you're farming and you say, hey, what's that over there? Why is it like that? Well, they had planted their hemp next to a cornfield in 2019. And this part of the interface, I'll call it there, got planted with hemp, but it was burned down with a corn burn down program with herbicide. And they noticed that in that area, the hemp did like really well, considerably better compared to the stuff that didn't get that corn burn down. And so they wanted to learn more about that. And so they did a study in 2020, so this year, where they looked at this treatment number 1 that kind of represents that area where they did that corn burn down. And they did it early. They did a corn burn down early, let's call it, glyphosate, a late burn down, a late termination of that wheat cover crop just by, cutting it, rolling plus glyphosate, rolling only, and a late termination hay cut, and then conventional till. And here is what they're seeing. They don't have the grain data yet, but they took some earlier season observations. And here it looks like that early burn down with the glyphosate did significantly better than all the other treatments in terms of stand, plant stand. And in terms of plant height, both the burn down, the glyphosate burn downs did significantly better than conventional till. So this is something I'm sure they're going to be pursuing and might give us some clues on where we should go with our field preparation too. Along the lines of planting, in North Carolina, Janine Davis is one of our colleagues down there who's been doing hemp for several years. And they wanted to look at, well, everyone's using a drill to do their planting, right? Like a grain drill. But could we broadcast this stuff and just, fling it out there and see how it establishes and performs? And they saw that for some of the varieties, you take a real hit that way. Like Xanthica, the one that we heard Rodale Institute really likes. They drilled it and they broadcast it, and the drilling did much better. But then some of these other varieties, like these true fiber varieties here, Fedora and Felina, they actually got really good stands with broadcasting too. So that's something to consider as well, depending on your equipment and what your needs are. At Montana State, they have also been doing variety trials, but they're looking also at planting date and seeing how much of a hit you take if you plant later. We know this is a plant that likes, our photo period. It likes a long photo period. And then when, we hit that solstice, it starts saying, okay, I'm going to flower now and die. So they looked at how much biomass gets hit and how much seed yield. And they did see a significant difference. This was from the beginning of May to the end of May. This reflects a lot of what we have been seeing here in Pennsylvania as well. They also looked at a lot of the same varieties, and there's no, crazy news here. So I'm going to keep moving through this for time. I really wanted to get to this last thing about fiber and green hemp and looking at the future of weed control. So those of us who are not working in organic systems are really interested in getting some weed control products that, maybe we're using in other systems and would also work well in hemp, but nothing is labeled at this time. None of our conventional products are allowed to be used at this time. What it takes is research like this to find out how these are going to perform and how much injury there might be to hemp to get those things labeled. So these are pre-emergence herbicides that you will recognize if you farm in grain systems because they're already being used. Even if you farm in vegetable systems, a lot of these are used in both kinds of systems. And these are what our colleagues at Virginia Tech were looking at. And what they are seeing is, the level of injury. They care about how well it controls weeds, but basically any weed control is going to be better than hand weeding, right? But what they're really concerned about is, well, is this going to ding the hemp? And if so, how much? And a lot of these products did. So these are two different sites. The two different colors are two different sites in 2019. But two of these products, Sonolin and Prowl, are still contenders because they didn't ding it that much. They looked at post-emergence products. So after the hemp plant is up, what can you spray over the top? And again, a lot of these same chemistries are available in other farming systems. And so low-hanging fruit, let's go for those. And they actually found 5 products that did very well. They did not ding the plant that much at all. And if so, the plant grew out of it, no problem. So these are all still contenders. So, you know, what they've found is really these 2 for pre-emergence so far. Again, nothing is labeled yet. This is not legal to use. But these are the ones that maybe we'll continue pursuing. And then to control broadleaves post-emergence, Moxie, which is basically bucktrail, Stinger, to get grasses, Select Max, Post, and Assure 2. And so using those in combination, like for instance, the bucktrail type product plus Select Max. Well, does it work? Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's still better than hand weeding, right? And there is some necrosis of the lower leaves that we're seeing here, but the thing grows out of it. So these are still on the table for use in the future if a label is pursued. So like I said, no labels yet. Even if they do get registered, you got to check with your buyer or your processor to see if they're going to allow you to use them. So just looking to the future. There is this IR4 project, which is a program to get products labeled on smaller crops, and hemp is definitely considered a smaller crop. And so they are pursuing Sonolin and Assure for sure. But they've got to have the cooperation of the companies that make these products to pursue these labels. Otherwise, no dice. So we'll see. The Moxie got pulled, but maybe in the future, we will get support from those companies. Dual and Select, similar. They're currently not supporting them, but maybe in the future they will. So that was everything about fiber. I've got a little bit to share on Penn State hemp. And I saw Francesco was with us here today too, so he can also chime in when I get things wrong or, you know, steer us wrong. But are there any questions up to this point that you think I should address yet, Heather?
I don't think so. I mean, I do think this whole conversation around like getting a really solid stand is critical. And you know, I think that has a lot to do with the overall like condition of the soil before planting, after planting, and just in general, based on my experience too, in conversations with folks in other countries and regions. So, you know, the hemp just does not do well when there's that crusted soil layer. And anyway, something we need to work on, but I think really the best strategy is to be using fields that have really good soil structure and that we're not rushing planting to beat a rainstorm.
Yeah,
because
that was a mistake for sure for us.
Well, no, I mean,
we absolutely did that.
I think a lot of people do, and we have too. And one of the Canadian farmers that I've worked with said to me one time after all of that, and he said, you know, normally you would rush to get a bunch of stuff planted right before a storm, just get everything done. And he said, that's the last thing you want to do with hemp. You want to make sure that you have like good enough soil moisture to get that seed to germ right away, to have the ground warm enough, and that know that the chance of a heavy rain is pretty minimal after you plant. But you know, who knows with climate change.
Right, our instincts.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay, well, I'll just share a little bit about our CBD hemp that we've been working on together before I turn it over to Heather, who's going to share a whole bunch more. And Francesco, do feel free to chime in here because I'm going to be sharing his slides really, because he's heading up our portion of essential oil hemp variety trials. And he's really been instrumental in figuring out how we grow this in a variety trial situation. So what we're looking at here is one of a few trials we did at both our location here in Lancaster County and up at Rock Springs, where he's based. And, you know, we have these two sectors of CBD type hemp, auto flower or day neutral type hemp versus photoperiod sensitive. And so these day neutral varieties are really interesting to us. You know, they have some certain benefits that we can envision, including, you know, shorter crop production cycle, better ability to time it, possible mechanization of planting and harvest and management issues. So there's a lot of things that make day neutral hemp attractive. And breeders who have been working with it have bred this specifically toward this sort of broad field production sort of system. So we did look at some of those this year, and you can see on the bottom some of the varieties we were looking at. Now, what I showed right here was two different situations. Okay, so we direct seeded in the field. So made a little ridge so the seed could rest in there, planted one by one, spaced out by hand, little precious seeds, and put a little bit of potting soil on top of it to hold it down so it didn't blow out of there. And so that it could have a little bit of moisture. And we did drip irrigate that because we were not willing to let anything fail because it didn't get water. These seeds were too precious. We didn't have many of them. With the remaining seeds, we took them into the greenhouse and said, okay, we're going to, just in case this fails, we're going to germinate these in these little Ellie pots, these little plug situations. And then we're going to also plant these transplant-like and see how they do. And kind of opposite of what Steve Groff was telling us about his photoperiod sensitive hemp this morning, we found the opposite was true of this day neutral stuff. So the stuff that we direct seeded actually behaved differently from a success standpoint than the stuff that we transplanted. So here in the field, sometimes we got much lower emergence, and you're seeing that in these green bars here. The Ellie pot emergence was sometimes very much better, sometimes not that much better. But where we really saw a difference was the success in the field. And you can see that even though we got transplanted stuff that emerged well, it did not meet the same success in growing. And you can see the visual difference here. So the direct seeded stuff was much more successful than the transplanted stuff by the end of the season. So that is one thing that we found, and we're still processing the data for this, but that was at least something that we could share with you today. On the other hand, we also had a bunch of photoperiod sensitive varieties. And, you know, the advantages here are generally they're going to give you a bigger plant, right? You can do different sort of culture. You can do it more like you would do tomatoes, other vegetables. It's higher labor intensity, but it pays off quite a bit. So we looked at 3 seed varieties and 6 clones. And here is some of the initial biomass results that we're seeing. Again, the analysis for THC and CBD is still in process, so we don't have that to share with you yet. But we can see total biomass, and really what I would look at is this orange bar to give you what you could expect in terms of extractable biomass. This was the whole plant stripped, okay? But it's also nice to look at the amount of stem, because if you don't want a lot of stem, you can see here which varieties are going to give you less to have to deal with. For instance, Southern Sunset is nice that way. Actually, Southern Sunset is one of the ones that has a lot of stem to deal with. Southern Luck is better in terms of the ratio. And I know Heather deals with the same thing, and she's taken really good notes on the varieties that way. And the last thing I want to share with you is something interesting that Francesco noticed, was that in certain sections of the Rock Springs field, he was getting some necrosis, some discoloration, some stunting. And so he took some plant tissue samples and some soil samples to find out what was going on. What he found was in those areas where he was seeing that plant damage, we had really low pH. And so you can see it, the whole field is not really high in pH, it's approaching 6. Excuse me. But in those areas where it dropped, we got a lot of manganese in the plant tissue. So we were seeing manganese toxicity in these plants, and that was the issue that was going on. They were actually really accumulating. And we saw this morning the concern that people have with hemp hyperaccumulating. And, you know, we didn't know to expect this. We're the folks who tell you to soil test till the cows come home. But, you know, this was one section of that field, which was less than an acre. So you really got to get a good soil test to find out if you might be even looking at issues. And sometimes you don't even get to know unless you test like very frequently. So that's something to just keep in mind. And so that was pretty interesting. Last thing I just want to put out there is that yes, we are looking at spotted lanternfly on hemp to see if it's really a threat or if it's just kind of a nuisance. So far, we've done very small, tiny little research on this so far, but we caged in some spotted lanternflies with some hemp plants this summer to see, you know, and we shoved a bunch of nymphs in there and said, live or die. All you've got to eat is this hemp. And if you can eat hemp and you can live on hemp, you can survive. If not, we're going to count your dead bodies and learn that you can't survive on hemp. So the outcome of that was, yes, they can feed and survive on hemp, but not real well. It's really not a preferred food source. We don't know yet if the spotted lanternfly feeding is going to affect crop quality and yield. I get the sense it's probably not going to, because hemp can take a lot of abuse that way. And really, they stick their little proboscis into the side there, and it's probably not causing very much damage. But we would like to learn more about this. And so we're going to keep doing this if there's funding in 2021. We'd also like to know, does plant maturity affect how attractive it is or how susceptible it is to the spotted lanternfly? So our folks who are doing this research are Lauren Briggs and Heather Leach. And so we hope to learn more about that next year. So I'm going to end my part of the slideshow and see if there's anything I need to address for you guys. Okay. And you know what? I'm going to let Heather take over, and I'm going to look through the chat and see if I can chat you guys some answers to any questions I might not have addressed already.
Let me get that undone. Lots of great information. Let's see here. My thing doesn't want to. There we go. Well, thanks everyone. And that was these kinds of presentations always provide a lot of great information, but yet a lot of great information. So trying to process everything, and now I'm about to give you even more. So like Alyssa said, I'm going to focus on some of the work that we've been doing, North Carolina State, and a little bit from Cornell as well on hemp essential oil research is what we're calling it, I guess, in our sort of academic circles. So really this is hemp being grown for CBD, CBG, maybe terpenes, other cannabinoids. And I've been working on essential oil research now, hemp research since 2015, and this type of hemp research since 2017 or 18. And as Alyssa said, we are just like racing to try to get resources to, get research moving and out the door to people like yourselves that need it, but we just can't move fast enough. So all the collaboration that we can get with growers is really helpful. So I have started doing some nitrogen fertility work. Basically, we hear a lot about how too much nitrogen or too little nitrogen can really impact the THC and CBD concentrations of hemp. We hear all kinds of things in, I guess, what I might call the gray literature, and even academic literature, that high nitrogen can stimulate the formation of male flowers. That's in the scientific literature. That we know that with deficiency, growth and flowering can be really slowed, and that plants will become mostly male. So you can see that conflicting information. Too much N stimulates male flowers, not enough N stimulates male flowers as well. So, it's really trying to figure out what should we be doing to end up with, the highest yields and quality that people are looking to obtain. We know from the literature that whole plant hemp biomass usually contains about 3 to 4% nitrogen, 2 to 3% potassium, and 0.5 to 0.6% phosphorus. So it looks like some of the other crops that we grow, and it requires a lot of nitrogen, far more nitrogen than some of the other nutrients. It's also a heavy user of magnesium and some of the micronutrients that people are applying to those plants, like boron as an example. So what we were doing is applying different rates, split application rates of nitrogen to these plants that, again, were being grown for CBD production. And we conducted this study in 2019, and we repeated it again this year. So we applied 0 nitrogen up to 150 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. The nitrogen was applied in many applications. So essentially, we applied the nitrogen through the drip line. So we weren't applying all of this at once. It was split actually over 8 different irrigation timings. Now, what I want you to notice is that when we applied 125 pounds of N per acre, and all of this nitrogen was applied up to flower initiation, you can see that we hit that 3% nitrogen mark. We also fell in the range for phosphorus, which was 0.5 to 0.6. The adequate range for magnesium, and also for potassium. When we applied more nitrogen, we didn't see any gains, which means that for this particular experiment and this year, that 125 pounds of nitrogen kind of was the maximum taken up by the crop, okay? So we again repeated this year, and there's other institutions that have shown very similar nitrogen rates that are needed by hemp, both grain, fiber, and again, these are plants being grown for CBD. So how much N you need to apply really needs to be based on past management and the type of fertility sources that you're using. But in general, we know that that's about the maximum that most plants are going to take up. All right. So how did this impact yield? We actually didn't really see any significant difference in flower yield per acre. We did see a difference in overall plant size. So it seemed like with more nitrogen plants were investing in stem and not necessarily in flower yield. So I think this is something we need to continue to work on and look at. And so again, this is dried flower per acre over the different nitrogen rates. And we also looked at, did applying these low rates or high rates impact total CBD or total THC? And no, they didn't. It did seem like we saw a slight increase here at 100 pounds of N per acre, but none of this was statistically significant. And same with THC. So we didn't see any difference with these various treatments. Again, we're repeating that. There are other studies that have shown this same trend. We are continuing to try to understand how nitrogen rates might impact terpenes. It really was not clear from our first year of the study. Some, there seemed to be no impact. Others, there seemed to be some. Sometimes it was negative, sometimes it was positive. So I think we definitely need more work to understand how nitrogen impacts the terpenes in these plants. We have done quite a bit of work now on varieties, and we continue to do this. This is a question that keeps coming up from growers, and people are asking, well, what are the best varieties to use here in the Northeast that have good tolerance to disease, good tolerance to insect pests, that meet the regulatory requirements, so on and so forth. And we have some data, but not nearly enough data to answer that question. And of course, I think the big thing, the big take home message here is that a lot of the varieties on the market they're not meeting the regulatory standards. And this is going to become probably even more challenging with these new USDA rules that now maybe will go into place next year. But in our trial last year, we had 3 varieties that were not compliant. And when I say not compliant, this was over 1% total THC, which is what's allowed in Vermont at this time. Some of these were way over. This variety in particular was actually at 4% THC. So not even close, and these seeds are being sold, all over the country, and, certainly really dangerous for a grower. The risk is really high, especially, when you're basing your purchase on this certificate of analysis that basically says, oh no, this is fine. The THC level in here is only, 0.29%. And this is just an example. This wasn't a variety in our trials, but the point being that we just don't have we don't have a ton of stable varieties out there. So, I think everybody's suggestion right now is to really, try to purchase seed from companies that have been in business and have shown by growers around you and the fact that they're probably still in business, that they're producing varieties that are going to be compliant. Here's dry matter flower yield, and you can see that ranges considerably as well across all these different varieties. Dry matter flower yield is important, obviously, especially because that's where most of the highest concentrations of these essential oils are. But I still think there's a lot of considerations that we have to think about beyond yield to be making our variety selections. Usually we're looking at yields, but in the case of hemp, we have a lot of other parameters we need to look at. So at North Carolina State, Janine Davis and Margaret Bloomquist have been doing a lot of very similar work. So here are the different varieties that they've been evaluating. This is fresh biomass per 5 plants, so it's on a different scale. But I think the point really being that there's a lot of variation, not just between the strains, but even within them. So here's this 5 plants, and you can see just the variation in yields between plants. And I'm sure most of you have seen that variation out in the field. And again, here's another slide that shows the floral yield. And again, this isn't my research, so I'm not exactly sure if this is dry pounds per plant or wet pounds. This is dry matter weight of the plant. So who knows? But again, the point being that there's a pretty wide range out there of yields. And like we showed as well, there's, not too many of these varieties that are meeting the regulatory standards at this time. And so it's really going to limit what people have to choose from for varieties for sure. One of the things that we've been looking at really closely is, I guess, a lot of parameters, especially if you're harvesting by hand, even if you're harvesting by hand with some mechanization like buckers and trimmers. One of the things we're really kind of honing in on is how long it takes to harvest a plant. Like, what's its harvest stability? And here are 3 different varieties. This is from 2019, a variety called Vermont Cherry, Alexa, AC/DC. You can see the size of these plants, the kind of shape of them is really different. Vermont Cherry was a very small plant, but it was mostly flower buds. It took about 3/4 of an hour per plant to fully process. And that's basically, take it out of the field, pull off all the leaves, trim all the buds. So really going right to the final product. And you can see that it took 5 hours to harvest an AC/DC plant. So even though we had higher yields off from the AC/DC plant, does that mean that that's a variety we really want to grow if it's going to take 5 hours a plant? So the harvest efficiency, I think, is really important. So here you see with Vermont Cherry, we can actually harvest, a pound of dry bud every hour versus with AC/DC, less than half a pound. So this is something that we're looking at in our variety trials, because I think this is a really important piece, especially with hand harvesting, which many people are doing in our region. So again, just thinking about size, if size matters. The other thing that we've been measuring is how much leaf is present. And if you are harvesting by hand, you know what a pain all those leaves are. And it takes a lot of time to remove those leaves, whether you have a trimmer or you're doing it by hand. So varieties that tend to have more bud than leaf, we think are advantageous. And that's something that we're measuring. So again, here's this Vermont Cherry that had the fewest amount of leaves and the most buds. So the bud to leaf ratio in our mind was better. So again, these are some of the characteristics that we are looking at UVM, and I will post my website. All of this information is online through our work. So another question that people have been asking, we've been interested in, as well as other universities, is really kind of what's the best planning scheme. And, Alyssa was talking about these day neutral varieties or autoflower varieties that tend to be planted quite close together because of the nature of the plant. And those are, 2 feet by 2 feet. And depending on who you talk to, some people are putting them 1 foot by 1 foot. And then we have some of our full season varieties that we're planting, at 6 by 6 or 5 by 5. And is there an ideal plant spacing that we should be using? And we have looked at this, agronomically, but we actually haven't looked at the return on investment, which I know a lot of people are interested in, and we're getting to that. So this is a full season variety, Box or Box, however you pronounce it. 1 by 1 foot spacing. You can see the yield in pounds per acre is highest with the 1 by 1 foot spacing. And when you're looking at pounds per acre, certainly you have a lot more plants out there, and so the yield is going to be higher. The other thing you might notice is that the unmarketable yield in those 1 by 1 foot plants is also quite a bit higher as well, which you would likely expect because the plants are kind of crammed together and there's more chance of disease. which we did see with the 1 by 1 foot spacing, especially in our climate that tends to be wet. A lot of powdery mildew on those plants and other disease issues. We didn't see a huge difference, but a little bit of difference where we saw more leaves on the 1 by 1 foot plants compared to the 3 by 3 or the 5 by 5 plants. But overall, there wasn't a huge difference in the percentage of leaf, bud to stem. Now, if you're looking at the CBD content, you can see that the CBD content did not seem to change regardless, or CBD concentration did not really change regardless of the plant spacing. So it was right around 10% in this trial. So if you're looking at yield per plant, it's a very different story, obviously, right? So if you're harvesting individual plants going for a higher end market, smokable bud, as an example, you know, you're definitely really going to want to focus on those individual plants and the flower buds themselves. And in that case, when you look at this data, obviously, plants that have more space were yielding more per plant than those that were planted closer together. All right. So we've also been looking at planting dates. And, you know, we hear from people all the time, well, I planted in May, it was a disaster. Well, I didn't get my seed or my clones weren't ready, so I didn't plant until July, and I still was able to get a yield. This has been mentioned. I was on another hemp call today, and it was mentioned where, you know, selecting varieties that mature early in our climate is really important. And also getting them planted timely is also really important. So here you can see the same variety. This is box as well, planted on the 10th of June and then weekly, basically over a 3-week period. And you can see we maximize yield when we were planting in that, you know, mid-June, 2nd of June, or second week of June time frame. And then the yields just went down after that. The other thing that went down was the CBD concentration. Now, again, you have to remember here, you have less time in the vegetative stage at this point, and then really less time to be accumulating essential oils as these plants are planted later. So, you know, getting those plants in the ground earlier, I think, is definitely advantageous. Earlier planting also led to less flowers or less leaves, sorry, which again, if you're harvesting by hand, you don't want that many leaves. Okay, North Carolina State again is doing much of the same research. They looked at 1 by 1 planting, 4 by 4, 5 by 5, and 6 by 6. And of course, you know, saw a very similar trend to us. They didn't see a huge difference in yields between 4 by 4 and 6 by 6. But they did see a difference in yields when you went down to 3-foot spacing. Okay, so we saw something very similar where a 5 by 5 spacing was different than the 3 by 3 spacing. But this is interesting to note that the 4 by 4, 5 by 5, or 6 by 6 spacing did not produce any yield advantage. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, you know, it really depends on probably planting date also, but you know, money that you're spending on clones and plant propagation. Okay. They also conducted a planting date study, and similar to us, when they were planting earlier, which again, this is down in the South, they were getting higher yields versus moving into July, which we've seen very similar results. They also looked at harvest date, and they didn't see any significant difference there. One of the things that we're looking at also is the tolerance of these varieties to different pests, and this is just disgusting. Ugh, gosh, I'm sure everybody's looking at this going, how gross, look at all those. I'm grossing myself out. So we do evaluate all the varieties throughout the season on pests, aphids primarily, powdery mildew, botrytis, and, corn borer. This is from 2019. Clearly, there was a difference in susceptibility of these plants to aphids. And again, this is just 1 year of data, so we have to keep evaluating this. But again, very important because aphids can, ruin your crop. Botrytis and gray mold, we have been looking at some biologicals to try to understand if there's anything out there really that's going to work on hemp, kind of that late in the game during flowering to protect the plant from gray mold or botrytis, which is a real issue in the Northeast. So we've trialed a few products. This was 2019. We did a similar trial this year. I haven't processed the data yet. We didn't have a lot of bud rot, but there was a minor significant difference, but nothing to write home about. And we're going to continue to evaluate these products because I know people are asking, what do we do? Irrigation. So we have looked at irrigating versus not irrigating, and especially with these type of higher value crops, irrigation can help definitely provide water during periods where high water demand is occurring. And you can grow hemp for CBD without irrigation, but we do see a yield response when we have supplemental irrigation. And hopefully you heard that supplemental irrigation in there. I think this is a piece we need to work on in the Northeast, is managing irrigation on hemp, supplementing and really understanding when it needs water, not just watering because we have irrigation. So Janine Davis, again, has also looked at sort of growing hemp on plastic versus not plastic. This is a kind of standard tobacco bed that they use in North Carolina, but I just thought it was interesting that they looked at basically plastic versus no plastic, just kind of a raised bed. They didn't see any difference in yields. We have done some similar work, not intentionally, but we do have trials that are on bare ground versus on black plastic. And it really does depend on the year and the situation, but they can yield comparably. But certainly the plastic in the Northeast can offer some advantages, and but also offer some challenges with sustainability and equipment and so on and so forth. Just to wrap things up, because we're seriously running out of time, is that we've been looking at some plant stresses, myself and some folks at Cornell. One of the questions that came up this year was the fact that we got a frost here in Vermont in September, early September, and people were really worried about their hemp. Then we continued to get cold weather in September into October during harvest timing. And really, I think we got snow. It was pretty miserable. So, part of the take-home message here is we really need to find varieties that also mature earlier. So Vermont cherry, which I've mentioned a few times, only because I feel like it had these characteristics that I was really interested in. And one was, it was early. It was ready to harvest Labor Day. And that to me was, woo, this is awesome. It was easy to harvest. It was mostly flower buds. It yielded about 1,500 pounds of flower per acre dry. And, I felt like it took a good amount of risk out of, those other full season varieties that aren't ready until mid to end of October. So, we have kind of looked at the impact of cold weather, and this is only temperatures that are hitting, about 28 degrees. And so you can see on this graph, the blue line was hemp that was, out in the open, and basically it was exposed to 28 degree temperatures a couple of times below 30 a few times, so about 4 times total. And then we put row cover over some other hemp just to keep it warmer. And then we compared the two. So you can see where there was row cover, it never got below 30 degrees. So ultimately what we found was the CBD concentrations did not seem to be impacted by those low temperatures. Now, the overall quality of the plant, the leaves, the stems, all those kind of things start to degrade really quickly once they get frosted and frozen. So, you know, ideally you want to get those plants out of the field as soon as possible, because it's just going to lead to, you know, other issues. But you can see when we were getting those cold temperatures, really the CBD concentration was not really being impacted that much or at all. Jacob Tooth at Cornell has looked at other stressors, because we hear this a lot about if you put stress on hemp plants, they're going to spike in THC. And he actually didn't find that to be true. You can see these are various stressors that he was adding to there's 3 or 4 different varieties. I can't remember. It's averaged across all the varieties. And you can see, you know, they were adding flooding and powdery mildew and, you know, all different kinds of stressors on these plants. And it really wasn't impacting the THC or the CBD concentrations. The only thing that really did, and it looked like it lowered THC and CBD, was this application. I think it was Roundup that they sprayed the plant with and tried to damage it. And you can see that it obviously, once it was sprayed, I think the plant just did not continue to develop as quickly, obviously, because it was damaged. So we have more work to do on this topic of stress on hemp plants and how it impacts, you know, the cannabinoids themselves. I know there's a lot of concern around that, especially because, you know, fields, varieties, farms, you know, are not meeting regulatory requirements. I would say probably the first step is getting some stable genetics so that we know at least right from the get-go, we have a fighting chance at meeting the regulatory requirements. So I just want to end on, you know, work that we're doing now, which is really focused on crop rotation and really thinking about where hemp fits best in our rotations. What are the advantages that it provides to the other crops that we work with? We know that hemp is susceptible to many diseases and some that are transferred or problems in other crops too, like white mold being one of those. Really, hemp should be, I said, every 1 to 2 years here, but you know, the little bit of literature that's available says that you should not be growing hemp more than 2 years in a row. And really, because of the different diseases, you should be waiting ideally 4 years or more before you go back into a field with hemp. So this is kind of our next set of work, looking at rotations and cover crops and trying to build a real sustainable system. We hear a lot about that with hemp, that it is, you know, a sustainable crop and it can be for sure. But again, you know, all of this comes down to how we choose to manage this crop in the future. I guess I'll end on this. You know, we are doing some work on drying temperatures, looking at ambient versus 80 degrees heat applied and 105 degrees heat applied to flower buds that have been bucked and trimmed, and basically looking at CBD concentrations. We haven't looked at everything else. We haven't had the funding to do that. And then also looking at storage temperatures, so how this hemp is handled after harvest, and food safety and quality. So all these topics, a lot more work to do. The North Carolina State website is awesome. They have so many resources. PennState, I mean, there's tons of resources building out there. And then our website as well, we have a lot of information there too. So I will stop with that.
And I dropped those websites into the chat for all the ones you mentioned and Cornell's. So if you guys, you can actually click right through on those if you want.
Oh,
There were a few questions that came through. One is the variety Seba, is that photoperiod sensitive? Do you know?
yes, it
Okay.
is.
It looked that way to me. So
Yep.
that was one. And have you done any population trials on autoflower type varieties?
We've only grown the autoflowers in 2x2, and then we've also grown them in 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet.
Okay.
And yeah, though in those particular spacings, we haven't seen any yield difference. We just did that this year.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice frontier to go to. Carla wants to know, how did Vermont Cherry perform in terms of THC content?
Yeah, it did meet the 1% Vermont regulatory requirement. But I don't remember specifically. It should be on it should be in our research report.
Okay, and along the lines of THC, the 0.3% that we talk about, that number comes from legislation. So in order to get that fixed, it has to happen through our Congress people changing the law. So in case anyone is interested in that happening, that's where you need to put the pressure, not really USDA.
Yeah, I would agree. A lot of people are pushing for the 1% total THC, and I know Vermont Agency of Agriculture has, obviously suggested that, as others have too. But who knows?
And Tom would like me to ask about aphid treatments.
Yeah, we have sprayed for aphids because they have been so ridiculously high. And we can, in Vermont, we do have materials that we are, allowed to use in hemp. But again, that's state by state, and you need to check with your state really to see what's available for use. We sprayed with all kinds, not all kinds of materials. You used Trilogy, which is a neem product. We also used Pyganic, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. It's an organic pyrethrum type, which is a broad spectrum killer, which we didn't really want to use, but the Trilogy didn't even touch the little things. And then we also used a new product that we were experimenting with for a company, and that didn't work all that well either. So, there's soaps and things, but you definitely got to be scouting. I think, aphids are insect that are, they're born, they are born pregnant, so their turnaround time they can explode so quickly. So it's one of those things you really got to be out looking for and get on top of before it's too late.
Yeah. I dropped the link to the EPA's list of registered hemp pesticides. Anything that is on that list is okay to use in Pennsylvania by the PDA. And this says nothing about its efficacy though. So we don't have efficacy data on most of these products, and there is work to try and get some funding to do more of that research.
Yeah.
Okay, before you all go, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to be checking the forum that we have set up within this conference atmosphere, this thing we get to use. So if you have more questions, I'll try to also address them there or point you to the right person. But I also want to make sure that we thank our sponsors, Lancaster Farming, King's Agri-Seeds, PA Ag Business Development Center, and Air Products, because they really helped us make this happen this year in a way that would not have been possible without them. So thank you guys for joining us. And thank you so much, Heather, for joining us here in Pennsylvania from Vermont.
Yeah, thanks for having me, everyone.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks everyone.